We had planned this camping trip for weeks. It was me, Jake, Emily, and Sarah, all eager to escape the city and lose ourselves in the Great Smoky Mountains. We set up our campsite in a clearing near a small stream, the perfect spot with a stunning view of the mountains. The first day was perfect, hiking, laughing, and cooking dinner over the campfire. As night fell, we sat around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows. Eventually, tired from the day's activities, we crawled into our tents and drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of rustling outside the tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But then I heard it again. This time, it was different. The rustling was accompanied by what sounded like human footsteps, slow and deliberate. My heart began to race. I nudged Jake, who was sleeping next to me. He groggily opened his eyes and listened. The footsteps grew louder, approaching our tent. Jake carefully unzipped the tent door just a crack and peered out. I could see his eyes widen in the dim light from the dying campfire. There, standing by the fire, was a man. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows. He didn't move or say anything, just stood there, staring at our tent. My breath caught in my throat. Who was he? What did he want? Jake called out to him, his voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly and walked into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We sat there, frozen in shock, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade away. None of us slept much after that. When dawn finally broke, we emerged from the tent, exhausted and anxious. We decided to investigate the area around our campsite. To our horror, we found footprints all around the tent. They led to a small, hidden spot just a few yards away where it looked like someone had made a makeshift bed out of leaves and branches. The realization hit us hard. Someone had been watching us, possibly for hours. We quickly packed up our gear, eager to put as much distance between us and that eerie campsite as possible. As we hiked back to our car, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. In the end, we made it back safely. We never found out who that man was or why he had been there. But the experience stayed with us, a chilling reminder of how vulnerable we were out there in the wilderness. From then on, we were always more cautious, always more aware of our surroundings. The mountains were still beautiful, but they now held a darker, more mysterious edge. We had been planning our camping trip to Algonquin Park for weeks. It was supposed to be a fun getaway for me, Tom, Jenny, and Lisa. We were all excited to spend the weekend in the great outdoors, away from the stress of work and city life. The drive to the park was long, but the beautiful scenery along the way made it worthwhile. We arrived at our campsite in the early afternoon and quickly set up our tents. The spot we chose was perfect, nestled between tall trees and close to a clear, sparkling lake. After setting up camp, we spent the rest of the day hiking, swimming, and enjoying the fresh air. By the time the sun began to set, we were all tired but happy. As darkness fell, we built a campfire and gathered around it to cook dinner. The crackling fire and the smell of roasting hot dogs and marshmallows filled the air. We talked and laughed, sharing stories and enjoying each other's company. It was one of those perfect nights where everything felt right. Eventually, the fire began to die down, and we decided it was time to go to bed. We crawled into our tents, zipped up our sleeping bags, and settled in for the night. I was just starting to drift off when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like footsteps, but they were too light to be one of us. I told myself it was probably just an animal and tried to ignore it. The footsteps continued though, and they seemed to be getting closer. I sat up and listened more carefully. It was definitely the sound of someone walking. My heart started to race. I glanced over at Tom, who was already awake and listening intently. We decided to peek outside to see what was making the noise. Slowly and quietly, we unzipped the tent and looked out. What we saw sent chills down my spine. There, standing at the edge of our campsite, was a tall, dark figure. It was just standing there, watching us. Tom called out, "Who's there?" But the figure didn't respond. It just stood still, staring at us. We were frozen with fear, unsure of what to do. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. We zipped the tent back up and sat there in stunned silence. None of us slept much that night. Every little noise made us jump, and we kept imagining the figure standing outside, watching us. By the time morning came, we were exhausted and on edge. When daylight finally broke, we emerged from our tents and decided to investigate. We found footprints around the edge of our campsite, confirming that someone had been there. The footprints led into the woods and seemed to disappear among the trees. As we followed the trail, we stumbled upon a small, hidden spot where it looked like someone had made a makeshift bed out of leaves and branches. The realization hit us hard. Someone had been watching us, maybe even camping near us without our knowledge. The thought was deeply unsettling. We quickly packed up our gear, eager to leave the area and put as much distance between us and the strange figure as possible. As we hiked back to our car, we couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made us jump. By the time we reached the parking lot, we were all relieved to be leaving the park behind. We never found out who the figure was or why they were watching us. The experience left us all shaken and wary of camping in remote areas. From then on, we were always more cautious, always more aware of our surroundings. The beauty of Algonquin Park was still undeniable, but for us, it now held a darker, more mysterious edge. We often talked about that night, wondering who the shadowy figure was and what they wanted. Though we never found answers, the experience brought us closer together, and we learned to appreciate the unpredictability and mystery of the wilderness. I loved camping alone. There was something about being out in the wilderness, with just the sounds of nature for company, that made me feel truly alive. This time, I decided to explore the Black Hills in South Dakota. I had read about the area's beauty and its rich history, and I was excited to experience it for myself. I arrived at the trailhead early in the morning and spent the day hiking through dense forests and over rocky hills. The scenery was breathtaking. As the sun began to set, I found a secluded spot to set up my camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a stunning view of the hills in the distance. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and built a campfire to cook my dinner. As night fell, I sat by the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind blew through the trees. After finishing my meal, I leaned back against a log and gazed up at the stars. The sky was clear, and the stars were so bright it felt like I could reach out and touch them. It was getting late, so I decided to turn in. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and settled into my sleeping bag. I was just about to drift off when I noticed a strange light outside. At first, I thought it was the moon, but then I realized it was moving. It was a pale, bluish light, floating through the trees. I sat up, my heart pounding, and watched as it moved closer. Curiosity got the better of me, and I unzipped the tent to get a better look. The light was unlike anything I had ever seen. It moved smoothly, almost as if it were alive. I stepped out of the tent, and as I did, the light began to drift away. I followed it, keeping a safe distance, as it led me deeper into the forest. The light guided me to an old, abandoned cabin. It was small and weathered, with broken windows and a sagging roof. The light circled the cabin once, then disappeared. I stood there, staring at the cabin, unsure of what to do. The air felt colder, and a shiver ran down my spine. I approached the cabin cautiously, my flashlight in hand. The door was slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. Old newspapers and magazines littered the floor, along with some personal items, a cracked mirror, a broken chair, and a dusty bookshelf filled with yellowed books. As I explored the cabin, I found more clues about its past. There were photos on the wall, faded and torn, showing a family from what looked like the 1920s. A man, a woman, and 2 children smiled back at me from the pictures. The cabin felt like it had been abandoned for decades. I spent a few more minutes looking around before deciding to head back to my campsite. As I walked back through the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig made me jump. By the time I reached my tent, I was exhausted and my nerves were frayed. I finally managed to fall asleep, but my dreams were filled with images of the cabin and the strange light. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was shining, and the forest felt normal again. I packed up my gear and made my way back to my car, eager to put some distance between me and that eerie place. Later, I did some research and learned that the cabin was indeed haunted. It had belonged to a family that disappeared without a trace in the early 20th century. Some locals believed their spirits still lingered in the area, unable to move on. The experience left me with more questions than answers. I still love camping, but now I approach the wilderness with a bit more caution and respect. The Black Hills are beautiful, but they also hold secrets, and sometimes, those secrets are better left undisturbed. We had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. Yellowstone National Park was known for its breathtaking beauty and serene landscapes, and we were eager to experience it firsthand. It was just me and my wife, Claire. We packed our car with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bags, food, and other supplies, and set off on our adventure. After a long drive, we finally arrived at a remote part of the park, far from the usual tourist spots. We found a perfect spot to set up our camp near a small, clear stream. The first day was everything we had hoped for. We hiked through beautiful trails, admired the stunning views, and enjoyed a peaceful picnic lunch by a lake. As evening approached, we returned to our campsite, tired but happy. We set up our tent and built a small campfire to cook our dinner. The sound of the crackling fire, combined with the chorus of crickets and the distant call of an owl, created a perfect, tranquil atmosphere. After dinner, we sat by the fire, talking and laughing, sharing stories from our childhoods and dreams for the future. It was one of those rare, perfect moments where everything felt just right. Eventually, the fire began to die down, and we decided it was time to get some sleep. We climbed into our tent, snuggled into our sleeping bags, and quickly drifted off, exhausted from the day's adventures. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by a faint sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was the sound of someone crying. It was a soft, mournful sobbing, coming from somewhere close by. I sat up and gently shook Claire awake. She listened for a moment, and her eyes widened with concern. We debated what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it and hope it would go away, but another part of me felt compelled to find out who was crying and why. What if someone was in trouble? We decided to investigate. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously unzipped the tent. The night was pitch black, with only the faint light of the moon casting eerie shadows through the trees. Following the sound of the crying, we made our way through the dark forest. The sobbing grew louder as we approached a small clearing. There, sitting alone by a dying campfire, was a woman. She had long, dark hair that covered her face, and she was wearing a tattered dress. She sat hunched over, her shoulders shaking with each sob. We called out to her, asking if she needed help, but she didn't respond. She just continued to cry, as if she didn't hear us at all. We stepped closer, our concern growing. As we approached, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. Something about the scene felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, unsure of what to do. Finally, we decided to go back to our tent and report the incident to the park rangers in the morning. We slowly backed away, keeping an eye on the woman the entire time. As we turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. She was still there, sobbing quietly by the fire. Back at our tent, we tried to get some sleep, but it was impossible. The image of the crying woman haunted us, and the sound of her sobs seemed to echo in our minds. We lay awake, listening to the night, our nerves on edge. At first light, we quickly packed up our camp and headed to the nearest ranger station. We told the ranger on duty about the woman we had seen and described the location of the clearing. The ranger listened carefully, then gave us a solemn nod. He explained that over the years, they had received several similar reports about a crying woman in that area, but they had never been able to find her. He told us a local legend about a woman who had gone missing in the park many years ago. She had been searching for her lost child, and it was said that her spirit still wandered the forest, crying for her lost child. The ranger assured us that they would investigate, but his tone suggested that they didn't expect to find anything. We left the ranger station feeling a mix of relief and unease. The thought that we might have encountered a ghost was both thrilling and terrifying. As we drove away from the park, we couldn't help but keep glancing back, half expecting to see the woman standing by the side of the road, still crying. The experience stayed with us long after we returned home. We told our friends and family about it, but most of them were skeptical, suggesting that we had just been tired and imagining things. But Claire and I knew what we had seen and heard. Whether it was a ghost or just a lost, distressed person, it was an encounter we would never forget. From then on, every time we went camping, we were always a little more aware of our surroundings, a little more cautious. The wilderness, with all its beauty, also held mysteries and secrets that we couldn't always explain. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, we would hear the faint sound of someone crying, and we would remember the woman in the forest, forever searching and mourning.